Think about the Bible like you never have before. You're listening to Christian Questions. Experience more episodes, videos, and Bible study resources at ChristianQuestions.com. Our topic is, did Jesus teach that we are all unprofitable servants? During Jesus' ministry, he said a lot of hard things to those who needed serious correcting. Rightfully so, he was showing them what true godliness looked like. How do we explain him telling his closest disciples they were at best unworthy servants? That sounds cruel. But did he mean what he said? Here's Rick and Jonathan.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Rick. I'm joined by Jonathan, my co-host for over 25 years. Jonathan, what's our theme scripture for this episode?
Luke 17:10. So likewise ye, when ye shall have done all those things which are commanded you, say, we are unprofitable servants. We have done that which was our duty to do.
Every Christian will tell you that Jesus is the embodiment of righteousness, compassion, and mercy. We all agree that his impact on the world came through his uncompromising actions of selfless love that led to sacrificing himself as a ransom for all of humanity. Couple these actions with his words of encouragement and uplift to any and all who would listen, and you have a model of how God's love should unfold within humanity. It's with this resume in hand that we need to examine Jesus's parable of the unprofitable servant, as it sounds like the exact opposite of all that Jesus stood for. In this parable, he seems to tell his followers that whatever they do in God's service is what's expected of them and nothing more. What did Jesus mean? How does this harmonize with the rest of his teachings?
Let's begin by reading the parable. It's short and to the point. Luke 17:7-10. Which of you, having a slave plowing or tending sheep, will say to him when he comes in from the field, come immediately and sit down to eat? But will he not say to him, prepare something for me to eat, and properly clothe yourself, and serve me while I eat and drink, and afterward you may eat and drink? He does not thank the slave because he did the things which were commanded, does he? So you too, when you do all the things which are commanded you, say, we are unworthy slaves. We have done only that which we ought to have done. Now, the parable seems to say that we are essentially indentured servants to God. We are given tasks and expected to fulfill them without fanfare or thanks. Our job is to do our job, and that's it. Rick, it sounds pretty mundane.
It sounds mundane. It's like, yeah, do your job, and no, don't expect me to say thank you. And you think, well, wait. Jesus is telling us that because in this parable, God is the master. It's like, is God really that way? Let's figure this out. The immediate context of this parable gives us a few other lessons that we can attach to it that will help us understand what Jesus was driving at. The first 6 verses of Luke 17 highlight 3 specific lessons. Jesus begins this part of the context by speaking to his disciples, and this is going to be very important later on. So, Jonathan, we're going to look at Luke 17, 1-6. These are the verses leading up to the parable, and we're going to divide these verses into these 3 lessons. Let's start with verses 1 and 2.
And he said to his disciples, it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come, but woe to him through whom they come. It would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea than that he would cause one of these little ones to stumble.
We'll pause there for the first lesson. We're just going to mention the lessons. We'll come back to them in a few minutes. The first lesson is to be painfully aware of the serious sin of causing others to stumble. Let's go to verse 3 for the second lesson.
Be on your guard. Your brother sins, rebuke him. And if he repents, forgive him. And if he sins against you 7 times a day and returns to you 7 times saying, I repent, forgive him.
So the second lesson is the importance of having a forgiving and compassionate heart. We have to have that. That's what Jesus is saying. Let's go further now. The apostles actually respond to these lessons with, Lord, increase our faith. They're asking something interesting here in the middle of his lessons, which we're going to expand shortly. And this is Luke 17, verses 5 and 6.
The apostle said to the Lord, increase our faith. And the Lord said, if you had faith like a mustard seed, you would say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and be planted in the sea, and it would obey you.
So it's a lesson on faith. The third lesson is that deep and abiding faith can alter our life circumstances.
Wait, what does that mean?
All right, alter our life circumstances. In other words, it talks about this tree being cast into the sea. It can change the landscape of your life, having deep and powerful faith. We're going to expand that as we put this parable of the unworthy servant in its appropriate contexts. So we've got these three really big lessons spoken with very few words to precede the unworthy servant parable.
Well, why are these so briefly stated?
It's interesting. That's just a really good question. It's like, how come he doesn't spend time on these because they sound so big? I think that they're briefly stated because they're summing up a much larger context. These lessons are very likely being given to the same audience as was present in Luke chapter 15 and 16, where Jesus spoke 5 parables to a mixed crowd.
Okay, Rick, let's figure out how this works. Luke 15 sets the context, and he is surrounded by tax collectors, sinners, Pharisees, scribes, and disciples. Luke 15, 1 through 3. Now, all the tax collectors and the sinners were coming near to listen to him. But both the Pharisees and the scribes began to grumble, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable.
So this is the beginning of a large context, and you've got all of these different people here. And what Jesus does here is he then delivers the parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, the prodigal son, the unjust steward, and the rich man and Lazarus. These parables were spoken to all, especially to those considered lost.
And that's the tax collectors and the sinners.
Right. And to those who considered themselves to be the elite.
Scribes and Pharisees.
So Jesus spoke to this same crowd through Luke chapter 15, Luke chapter 16, and Luke 17 up through verse 10, which is the last verse of the parable we're considering today. Luke 17:11 gives specific indication of a completely changed venue.
Well, how do we know it's all one context?
Good question. And the answer is one word. One little word tells us this one context. And that one little word is translated but, or and, or now, or then, or moreover. It's a simple little word that's used like 3,000 times in the New Testament. And this word generally shows a continuation. And that's the key here. It shows a continuation. When used in relation to Jesus's preaching, it could be a continuation of one of two levels. It could be a continuation of the big picture of his ministry. He's preaching in this area, and he continued preaching in another city and another city. So you got the big picture continuation. Such is the case above, where you said in Luke 15, 1 to 3, it said, now, that's the word, the tax collectors and the sinners all came to him. It was setting up a new context. When this word for and or now, translated all these different ways, is used in Luke 15:11, it shows a continuation of the same physical context while adjusting the focus or the content of his teaching. So it's still showing a continuation, but here it's showing us it's within the context of where they are. Let's look at Luke 15:11.
And he said, a man had 2 sons.
Same word. So it's like there was conversation, and then he goes into the next parable. And he said, a man had 2 sons. Let's go now to the next time it's used, Luke 16, chapter 16, verse 1.
Now, he was also saying to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and this manager was reported to him as squandering his possessions.
Again, you start it with now. So you're picking up where you left off and going into the next piece. It's used again, the same little transition word, showing you that you're going from piece to piece of the same overall context in Luke 16, verse 19.
Now, there was a rich man, and he habitually dressed in purple and fine linen, joyously living in splendor every day.
And that's the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And that ends the 16th chapter of Luke. So it ends with this chapter. And typically when we talk about these things, we stop right there. You're ending the chapter. You're at the end of the chapter. You've been through these 5 parables. You take a breath and go, wow, that was a lot of lessons. However, and Jonathan, I have missed this. And you know, because I've been
I know.
complaining to you of my lack of ability to see this. I have missed this all this time. Luke 17 continues using the same word. Luke 17, verse 1.
And this is from the King James Version. Then said he unto the disciples, it is impossible, but that offense will come. But woe unto him through whom they come.
So you see that Luke 17 is just picking up again. He's changing the focus of whom he is speaking to.
Well, the translators may not have done this on purpose. They could have been looking for a place to start a new chapter.
Yeah, and that's an important piece of the puzzle, but it's very obvious that this picks up exactly where the previous parable left off.
And another point is that Jesus's lessons are often bundled or intertwined for the greater message.
When we see this parable of the unworthy servant in the context of those previous 5, oh my goodness, what a powerful message it is. Now, we know this whole context ends in Luke 17:11 because it shows us an entirely different context. Let's read that verse.
While he was on the way to Jerusalem, he was passing between Samaria and Galilee.
You know something else is happening now. Picked up,
Yes.
moving on. All right, so we're establishing that the unworthy servant parable is in the same context as the previous 2 full chapters of Luke. We're beginning to set the groundwork for finding worthiness in our unworthiness.
To truly grasp the import of Jesus telling his disciples that they are unworthy servants, we need to know why. It turns out that this parable is the culmination of a broad and piercing set of lessons that help define how God's plan of salvation would be put into place.
And we're only beginning here. It's so important to pay close attention to the context of all biblical teachings. To know the context is to better grasp the meaning.
If this parable is built upon all of the teachings before it, how do we break down what Jesus' specific message was to his disciples?
Well, the best way to go about this is to observe how he had communicated to his larger audience, all of those individuals. Jesus had a breathtaking ability to not only read the thinking of those who were listening, but also to craft a response to their thoughts and reactions that could show them higher and more righteous ways of serving God. And Jonathan, this hit me in a big way while studying for this particular episode, to see how Jesus could read the crowd, the scribes, the Pharisees, the sinners, the disciples. He could read the way they were thinking, and he could craft these stories right then and there to meet the needs, to show the bigger lessons. So as we approach the parable of the unprofitable servant, let's remember that Jesus' attention here was specifically, with this parable, turned to his disciples. It's reasonable to conclude that what Jesus will say next serves as the conclusion for this lengthy teaching to that mixed audience of sinners, tax collectors, scribes, Pharisees, and disciples in Luke 15, 16, and the first part of 17. This conclusion would follow the theme that Jesus began with, which was salvation for all. He introduced this vital part of the gospel, salvation for all, with the first 2 parables, which represented the big picture of everything else Jesus was about to unfold.
The parable of the lost sheep represents the entire race of humanity. Jesus left his heavenly home, recovered it, and returned to heaven. All of God's family rejoices. This is a picture of the ransom sacrifice of Jesus. Now, for the parable of the lost coin, a woman loses 1 coin from her complete set of 10. It causes her to go to any length to find it. It represents how the human race was part of God's intelligent creation and was lost and needed to be found in order to restore the harmony of his intelligent creation. So this parable is a picture of restitution.
So the first 2 parables were very big picture, the ransom and restitution. That sets the groundwork for everything else Jesus is about to teach through the next 3 parables, then his other comments, and then the parable of the unworthy servant. With the big picture in mind, let's begin with those 3 lessons. We touched on them very, very briefly in the first segment. Let's begin with those 3 lessons and unfold what their meaning is in relation to the previous teachings. Now, remember, the first lesson is to be painfully aware of the serious sin of causing others to stumble. So let's go back to Jonathan, Luke 17, 1-2.
Then he said to his disciples, "It is inevitable that stumbling blocks come, but woe to him through whom they come. It would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea, than that he would cause one of these little ones to stumble."
And remember, this is right after the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And it says it's inevitable that stumbling blocks will come. Now that you see there's a connection, you go, oh, wait a minute, there's something bigger here. While this lesson was important to them about being aware and not being one who causes others to stumble, they had witnessed the wrongdoing of this already in action. Who had been and who would be classic examples of what not to do regarding this lesson?
Well, the scribes and Pharisees, they were still listening when Jesus turned his attention to his disciples.
That's right. They're still listening. And when Jesus turns his attention, and again, this is my imagination, you've got the group of the scribes and Pharisees maybe over here on the left and the disciples on the right. When Jesus turns his attention to the disciples, you can imagine them kind of like leaning over like, what's he saying? How come he's not looking at us? What's going on over there? Because they want to know, because he's captivated all of them. So let's drop in on one part of the unjust steward parable. That was one of the previous 5, to see how Jesus illustrated these connections. So going to the parable of the unjust steward, let's sum it up and then read the first few verses.
Well, Jesus is extending the warning specifically to the Pharisees and scribes after their overt neglect of the most important parts of God's favor to Israel. He is telling them how they should act in light of their soon-to-be lost favor. Continuing with Luke 16, 2-3. And he called them and said to them, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, for you can no longer be a manager." The manager said to himself, "What shall I do, since my master is taking away the management from me?" He then cleaned up the delinquent accounts that he had neglected.
So this is the story, and this is what's happening in this particular parable. They were neglectful, and they, as a result of their neglect, were actually causing others to fall because they weren't doing their job. Now, Jesus concludes the story in Luke 16:9, and what he says sounds a little bit hard to grasp.
And I say to you.
And now, remember, he's speaking to his disciples here. I say to you, meaning the disciples. He's not speaking to the Pharisees, even though he's speaking about what the Pharisees had done.
Make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails, they will receive you into the eternal dwellings. What does that mean? That doesn't sound right. Friend of unrighteousness?
It doesn't. Again, this is parabolic. This is symbolic language. And it really is a little bit difficult to kind of get your head around. We investigated these parables in podcast 1081 when we were talking about these specific parables here and gave a lengthy explanation. So here, let's just give a paraphrase, if you will, of what he's talking about making friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of unrighteousness. Well, like what is he saying? So let me paraphrase. I tell you, my disciples, because this is Jesus speaking to his disciples, be merciful to and honest with all with whom you have dealings. Don't look down on those who are not in your position. That's exactly what the Pharisees had already done. Once this world and the comparably small responsibilities we bear in it passes, then you will be received into heavenly reward for being friends with those and being compassionate toward all of those individuals who were in the midst of unrighteousness.
Well, the account rendered up for the scribes and Pharisees was a complete failure. They were supposed to be shepherds for the people, not to stand above them.
Right. This is why when we look at this, when we look at the beginning lesson about not causing others to stumble, you can go back to the parable of the unjust steward and say, he looks like he's referring back to that. So as we unfold the context of, and then the parable of the unworthy servant, it's all built on what he already said. And as we go through this, we're constantly going to go back to, so what did he already say to build the foundation? Because the conclusion becomes very, very, very strong. And it comes down to helping us understand and helping us find worthiness in our unworthiness.
Sadly, the scribes and Pharisees were strong examples of neglecting a favored position of service for God. As Jesus was wrapping up this lengthy period of teaching that he began with the message of salvation, he warned those who would soon be given God's favor, the disciples, to accept it with overwhelming humility in contrast to those they had seen as their leaders.
So he had told stories that were really zeroing in on the spiritual elite, if you will. And he's now talking to his disciples saying, remember what I said to you before? Pay attention. See what we're laying out and see what you are supposed to stand for. Don't try this at home. That's what he's saying to them over and over and over again. He's telling them you have to rise to a different kind of level. So we've got that from that first lesson. Now, these are setting up for the parable of the unworthy servant. And if you get these lessons, that unworthy servant parable just opens way, way, way up. The second lesson, if you remember, from those verses leading up to the parable of the unworthy servant, is the importance of having a forgiving and compassionate heart. So now Jesus continues in Luke 17, leading up to the parable in verses 3 and 4.
Be on your guard. If your brother sins, rebuke him. And if he repents, forgive him. And if he sins against you 7 times a day and returns to you 7 times saying, I repent, forgive him.
So there's a powerful, simple, straightforward lesson here. And it's the lesson of forgiveness and a compassionate heart. And the profound connection is the parable of the prodigal son. Think about that parable. In that parable, the father represents God. The older son represents those of the Jewish people who outwardly kept the law and traditions. And the younger son represented the undesirables, the tax collectors and sinners in Israel. So you see the players in there. So now let's look at this lesson of forgiveness by going back to that previous parable of the prodigal son.
We drop in when the older brother finds out that his rebellious younger brother has returned home. Luke 15:25. Now, his older son was in the field, and that was by no accident. We're going to come back to that later. And when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. The older son found out what had happened and was disgusted. Continuing with Luke 15:29 through 30. And he answered and said to his father, Look, for so many years I have been serving you, and I have never neglected a command of yours, and yet you have never given me a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your wealth with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.
The lesson here is very, very simple. God, as represented by the Father, forgave that younger son. We, therefore, should be forgiving as well. Jesus had given us the reminder in that parable, and now he's telling his disciples directly about their responsibilities.
We're obligated to forgive.
We are. We are absolutely obligated because that's the pattern that we have been given. The scribes and Pharisees had been given the pattern of what the law stood for, and they built new patterns. They built new ways. They built new traditions, new rituals around it to make it more comfortable. Jesus is saying, don't go down those roads. Don't be like the older son in that particular parable. Again, this comes down to our looking at what Jesus taught to say, what's my job now as the disciple? How do I find worthiness in my own unworthiness?
As Jesus leads up to the unworthy servant parable, he reminds his disciples of the fundamental importance of forgiveness. His point is that they generally came from those not regarded as special. The disciples were fishermen, tax collectors, and zealots, and they needed to always keep the grace they had been given in the front of their minds.
And that's the key. He showed them an example of an older son in that other parable where there was no grace, there was no forgiveness. And he's saying, if your brother comes to you 7 times in a day and repents, you forgive him. He's showing, here's what I taught you before. Here's what I'm teaching you now. You saw what they did. Here's what you must do yourselves. Seeing these lessons unfold and relate to all Jesus had already taught make them so much deeper. And we haven't even looked at the parable yet.
So far, Jesus is focused on not stumbling others and being forgiving. What comes next before the unworthy servant lesson?
Next, we'll see Jesus build a foundation for this final lesson in a very different way. We began with 2 very cautionary points. Don't be a stumbling influence, and be sure to maintain a forgiving mindset. Next, Jesus will respond with an inspiring and uplifting lesson on faith. The apostles will respond after those last two lessons. They're going to respond with an interesting request about faith. Perhaps because those lessons were difficult, they were looking for uplift after the weight of Jesus had been giving them in those last two teachings.
Well, whatever the reason, remember that the whole crowd was still about to hear what was being said.
Right. It's important to remember the crowd is still listening. His attention is simply focused on his disciples. And remember that third lesson that we're going to get into right now is that deep and abiding faith that can alter our life circumstances. What does that mean? Well, let's look at Luke 17, verses 5 and 6.
The apostle said to the Lord, "Increase our faith." And the Lord said, "If you had faith like a mustard seed, you would say to this mulberry tree, 'Be uprooted and be planted in the sea,' and it would obey you."
You have these really short lessons, Jonathan. It's really striking that you've got these short lessons, and Jesus is simply saying them in a short fashion because he's got a basis that he already laid out for them in the previous parables. And what we need to do is just learn to go back to what's he referring back to. Jesus, in this lesson about uprooting this mulberry tree with your faith, he shows them what increased faith really looks like. He shows them that deep and abiding faith, even though it begins as tiny as a seed, can change the landscape of your life. Faith that doesn't look like it's much of anything. If you've ever seen a mustard seed, it is tiny. And you look at that and say, how does that big tree grow out of that tiny seed? That's what faith works like. And he's saying you don't have to have a lot up front, but you have to have the potential for it to grow. So we want to see what the connection is. Where do we go back to? What parable do we go back to see what Jesus is drawing upon?
Well, with this faith, let's go back to the connection with the parable of the prodigal son. But this time, let's focus on the wayward son coming back home and the faith it took for him to admit his sins and ask for mercy. Luke 15:18-22. "I will get up and go to my father and will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men.'" So he rehearsed this script and he knew exactly what he wanted to say and covered all the bases. Continuing. "So he got up and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion for him and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.'" Now,
see, he doesn't even get to finish his plea because his father is going to interrupt him. He's ready. He's rehearsed. He knows what's important, and he's going to say it, but his father doesn't even let him finish.
But the father said to his slaves, "Quickly, bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet." You know, the younger son had to humble himself to overcome his shame. Now that's complete repentance.
And he needed to have faith in going back to his father. And his faith was tiny and trembling. And he wasn't asking for anything but to just be part of the household. I'll be a slave. I'll do whatever it takes. So he had enough faith to journey back. And that's the faith, just like a mustard seed. And Jesus had that basis when he told him about the mulberry tree. Remember that, son? Remember how he had to journey back. He's showing them the walk of faith. It's such a profound lesson for us to hold on to. And you can see that, again, you have the previous parables, and Jesus, in saying these small, short things, they're much bigger than what he's just said because you've got the basis of what was said before. And all of those previous parables were showing the unfolding of the gospel truth. They were showing the ransom, restitution, and then the fall of Israel, essentially, through the next three parables. And he's saying, these are the examples that you don't want to follow. Follow the things that are worthy. We need to find worthiness in our unworthiness.
Great faith is rewarded with great blessing. That blessing does not come because we are worthy. It comes because we are first humbled and then welcomed by God because of grace, despite our unworthiness.
And Jonathan, see, this is setting up that final parable of the unworthy servant in a big way. He's already told us what it means with these three lessons and the backdrop of all of those other parables. And again, I got to pause here because this just blows my mind as to the wisdom and the power and the reasoning to draw this tremendously diverse crowd together to keep their attention and to give lessons that all of them could look at and say, Some of times they would look at it and say, he's talking about me. I don't like that. And he did that on purpose so they could see.
Except the scribes and Pharisees.
Yeah, they were difficult, but they grumbled because they knew that he was referring to them, and they tried to attack him, and he would just tell another story. That's how he got into the rich man and Lazarus. But after all that Jesus had spoken to this mixed crowd, he had now spoken directly to his disciples. Remember it in Luke 17, he's directly to his disciples. And he was wrapping up this period of teaching with the 3 lessons in place that we just talked about: not stumbling others, being forgiving, and having faith that can grow. He prepares for the big finale, the final lesson. For his disciples, this next lesson would be a powerful summation of who they were called to be. So he is set up for this with Luke chapter 15, Luke chapter 16, and the first few verses of Luke chapter 17. Now we come to this. Jesus begins by putting them into the master's position in this parable. He's going to be talking about a master and a servant. And he starts it out like, suppose it's you. So they could feel the power of the authority of the master. Luke 17, verse 7.
Which of you, having a slave plowing or tending sheep, will say to him when he is coming in from the field, come immediately and sit down to eat?
You can imagine the disciples listening to that. Yeah, hey, if I was the master, no, they've got more work to do. You can feel like, yeah, I could get into that power position. And again, he's so wise in how he does this. He's first focusing on the servant's labors outside of the house, plowing in the field or tending sheep, plowing in the field, tending sheep. Where else do we see someone in the field? Well, it was in the parable of the prodigal son. Jonathan, you pointed it out. The older son, Luke 15, 25 and 26.
Now his older son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard the music and dancing, and he summoned one of the servants and began to inquire what these things could be. Well, this son represented Israel's elite, those who would outwardly keep the law and traditions. Jesus shows us that they were servants, only in place to do what God had bid them to do, but their hearts were not in the right place.
So they were put in place to do specific work in a specific way, but their hearts weren't in the right place. They were doing the work. They were in the field, but they weren't accomplishing the mission of actually what being in the field was supposed to be. So going back to Luke 17 now with the actual parable of the unworthy servant, we see these responsibilities of this servant, this unworthy servant, as those done to keep the household running. This is your job. This is what you have to do. Jesus is likely alluding to the gospel work that his disciples would be called upon to do, and using their present experiences, looking at the scribes and the Pharisees and the spiritual leadership to show them what not to do. He gave them a sense of what to do by giving them the comparison of, here's the example you have. This is not what we're looking for. This is not what God wants from you through me. He wants something higher. We know that those in authority in Israel at that time were to be shepherds. We also know that it was prophesied that they would not fulfill their responsibilities. It wasn't just obvious by what was happening. It was obvious because prophecies told us so. One such prophecy is Jeremiah 23, verses 1 and 2.
Woe to the shepherds who are destroying and scattering the sheep of my pasture, declares the Lord. Therefore, thus says the Lord God of Israel, concerning the shepherds who are tending my people. You have scattered my flock and driven them away, and have not attended to them. Behold, I am about to attend to you for the evil of your deeds, declares the Lord.
So you have this powerful prophecy saying that there's going to come a time where God will deal with the shepherds of Israel. It was the time of Jesus that began to happen. So again, we see the previous parables and all the examples, and Jesus is setting the groundwork for this parable of this unprofitable servant. And he's saying that this servant is out doing the work that they're supposed to be doing. Just like the Pharisees and the scribes and the religious leaders were doing the work that they were supposed to be doing, but they weren't doing it in a godly fashion. So you see the shepherding aspect. And when you think about the fields and plowing the fields, you think about planting the crop and harvesting the crop. And then you think about the harvest of the gospel and all of these things and drawing in the true believers. Well, the field of the master must be plowed for the seeds to be planted for the harvest. Jesus alluded to this in John 4:35.
Do you not say, there are yet 4 months, and then comes the harvest? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, that they are white for harvest.
So all we've done up to this point with this parable of the unprofitable servant is look at the fact that they're out in the field and the fact that they're out plowing or shepherding, and you've got these things happening. And Jesus is using these examples because he's got the physical examples of what not to do in front of his disciples. He's telling this unworthy servant parable to his disciples and showing them examples. And all of these other pieces are saying, here's what the examples are showing. Don't do this. Don't do this. Don't do this. It comes down to finding worthiness in our unworthiness.
As servants, we are called upon to do the work of the gospel. The fact that the tasks in this parable were ongoing and repetitive shows us that what is required of Jesus' disciples is work that will always need to be done. This is our job.
It is our job. You work that doesn't seem to end. You say, well, when do we catch a break? Well, is your job done? That's the key. Is your job done? Well, I don't feel like doing it, but is your job done? This is what Jesus is teaching here. It's a very basic, straightforward principle. And from some aspects, you look at it and say, well, that sounds a little harsh. Well, stay with us because there's so much more to this than that. But this is an important point because those spiritual leaders of the day did not do what God would have had them to do. Here we're beginning to see what the responsibilities of discipleship truly are. There's always work to do, and it's not easily accomplished.
Now we finally approach the part where Jesus says we're unworthy. What did he really mean by that?
We've invested significant time in building the foundation for this most powerful point. What we've thus far seen is his focus on understanding what was happening around his disciples with the religious leadership. He would now show them how they needed to be different when it became their time to preach, their time to teach, and their time to directly serve God. He's making a statement with all of the buildup of Luke 15, Luke 16, and now into Luke 17. He's saying, look, this is the comparison. We need to understand where you are to go. Let's continue.
Back to the parable, rereading Luke 17:7. Which of you, having a slave plowing or tending sheep, will say to him when he has come in from the field, come immediately and sit down to eat?
Okay. You fulfilled your external tasks. You did the work that's outside. And now it's time to fulfill your internal tasks. The day's not over. Therefore, your work is not over. Let's go to Luke 17, the next verses 8 and 9.
But will he not say to him, prepare something for me to eat, and properly clothe yourself, and serve me while I eat and drink, and afterward you may eat and drink?
So this servant is not done with his work. The servant is to prepare the master's meal, to clean themselves up, to look presentable, and to serve. Jesus is teaching his disciples that their work in service to God also encompasses not only serving the household, all of the outside things, but serving the master as well, directly serving the master as well. And remember, the master, it pictures God, directly serving God. So this service to God, and I look at it as praise, this service, this praise is every bit as important as the servant's other work. And he's required to do this part very respectfully and reverently.
Clean yourself up and properly clothe yourself. This reminds me of the high priest in the tabernacle putting on new garments after the sacrifices.
Right. It's a different aspect. And this is the praise part. This is the part where you're still working, but it's a different kind of work. Another reference to Jesus' previous parables, because here he's saying, prepare me something to eat, properly clothe yourself, and so forth. Let's now look at the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in relation to this part of the parable of the unprofitable servant. Now, The rich man pictured the Pharisees and the ruling class as representatives of all Israel, and Lazarus, the name meaning whom God helps, represented all the nations of the world outside of God's favorite people. So you've got these two completely opposing parties in this parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Jesus taught that Israel was about to lose favor with God. In the parable, that meant being close to Abraham. And the Gentiles, who were pictured by Lazarus, were about to gain favor. So you've got Israel going to lose favor, the rich man, Lazarus, the poor man, the Gentiles going to gain favor. Why was this going to happen? Because the rich man was self-serving and not God-serving. This is a powerful lesson at the end of Luke 16 that is reminded of in this parable of the unprofitable servant. So, Jonathan, let's just read a small piece of the rich man and Lazarus, Luke 16, 19 to 21.
Now there was a rich man, and he habitually dressed in purple and fine linen, joyously living in splendor every day. And a poor man named Lazarus was laid at his gate, covered with sores, and longing to be fed with crumbs which were falling from the rich man's table. Besides, even the dogs were coming and licking his sores. The rich man seems to be oblivious to everything else around him.
He does. He's living in splendor every day. Everything is good because it's my world, my way, and I'm pretty happy with me. And that is not what service to God is about. So Jesus is showing his disciples what to do because he'd already shown them what not to do. Don't get so self-absorbed that you are living in splendor because you are chosen of God. That's not the point. That's what he's saying here. So this parable, while it's short, is powerful because it's built on 2 chapters of parables that show us the importance of rising up to what Jesus was looking for us to live up to. Let's continue with Luke 17, verse 9, back to our parable of the unprofitable servant.
He does not thank the slave because he did the things which were commanded, does he? No, really, he doesn't even say thank you. Is that right? It just seems off.
It does seem off, like not even saying thank you. It's almost like a resentful thing. And you think you're done yet?
Yeah, really.
But that's not the attitude that's being portrayed here. Not at all. As a matter of fact, where it says he does not thank the slave, that word for thank is the word in the New Testament used for grace. And when you understand that, it takes on an entirely different meaning. Just going to use 2 scriptural examples of this word for grace. The first one is in Luke chapter 2, verse 40.
The child, Jesus, continued to grow and become strong, increasing in wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him.
The word grace, that's the word grace. So he does not grace the slave. He's like, wait, that doesn't quite make sense either. Remember, grace is favor. Okay, it is favor that you are either showing or being shown. So this is important. We want to realize that the grace works both ways. Favor that you are showing or being shown. So that's just one example of how grace is used as grace. But in Luke chapter 6, it gives us a really strong example of what Jesus meant by he says he does not thank the slave. Luke 6, 32 and 33.
If you love those who love you, what credit or what grace is that to you? For even the sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit or what grace is that to you? For even sinners do the same.
So you see, the same word is used for what credit is that to you? In other words, Jonathan, if I love those who love me, and I think I'm so good. Hey, look, I love the people who love me. Jesus is saying, yeah, but everybody does that. Are you showing any great grace? Are you showing any great favor to others beyond what everybody else does? No, you're just doing what everybody else does. If I do good to those who do good to me, you take good care of me, Jonathan, I take good care of you, and I think I'm something very, very special. Jesus is saying, well, wait, everybody does that. What we're looking for is something higher. What Jesus is saying in this parable of the unprofitable servant is, when it says he does not thank him, he doesn't credit him with being gracious, being full of this overt giving, because he's simply doing what his job requirement said he was supposed to do. It takes that harsh edge off And it says, just do the job. You're doing the job that you were called upon to do. If you punch in the morning, I used to work in a countertop shop making countertops and cabinets, and we had jobs we had to do, and you finish the job, do what the allotment was for the day, and you walk away saying, okay, I did my job. Do they stop and say, wow, look at what Rick did? No.
No,
Why?
they don't do that.
No, they don't. You worked with me for a while. They
Yeah,
didn't.
you got a paycheck at the end of the week. That's all.
Right. Right. Because that's what you're contracted to do. So it's not that he doesn't thank him. This servant is not showing excessive diligence. They're just doing what they're called upon to do. We need to focus, do all of what we're commissioned to do. Why? Because it needs doing. That's why. Jesus is saying, live up to that. Don't get full of yourself. Pharisees already showed you that. I gave you lots of stories to show you what that brings you. Don't go there. So now we come to the conclusion of this parable of this unprofitable servant in Luke 17, verse 10.
So you too, when you do all the things which are commanded you, say, we are unworthy slaves. We have done only that which we ought to have done.
It's a simple ending here. This is the final lesson. We, as disciples of Jesus, are in fact commissioned with the serious work of walking in his footsteps. That is no easy task. To be clear, we're not even worthy to be in that position. Jonathan, there's nothing that you and I could bring to the table to say, I should be the one chosen.
No.
Nothing. Let's look at Romans chapter 3, verses 9 and 10.
And before we do, it's only by God's grace
Yeah.
and Jesus' sacrifice that we could even be worthy. It's not on any merit of ourselves.
Only by God's grace are we sitting here talking about this.
That's right.
That's really what it comes down to.
Again, Romans 3, 9 through 10. Are we better than they? Not at all. For we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. As it is written, there is none righteous, not even one.
None righteous, not even one. Well, the religious leaders of Jesus' time saw themselves as righteous. They saw themselves as worthy. They saw themselves as elite. They saw themselves as in the right position, having the right credentials, putting everything in place. That's how they saw themselves. Jesus is giving the message. You are not to be like that. You are to raise yourself higher by bringing yourself lower. That's the key. Do what's put before you and gladly do it because you have the privilege of doing it. The religious leaders of Jesus' time also saw themselves as highly qualified. They were special. They were unique. In contrast, our resume among our fellow human beings is not so very impressive, is it?
Not at all.
I look at you and I look at me and I think, wow. And think about this next scripture. I really appreciate this next scripture personally because it helps us to put things in real clear perspective. 1 Corinthians 1, 27 to 29.
But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things which are strong, and the base things of the world and the despised God has chosen, the things that are not, so that he may nullify the things that are, so that no man may boast before God. You know, Rick, there is no caste system in Christ. We are all in the same category.
And one of the key lessons for this parable of this unworthy servant is don't get full of yourself. Please. He has spent who knows how much time it took him to do the Luke 15, 16, and 17 parables and teachings. But he's showing them step by step how those who have gone before you got too full of themselves. They put themselves before the service. They put the shepherd before the sheep, and they took things out of context. And Jesus, by saying this, we at best are unprofitable servants. He's saying, let's just serve. And the beautiful thing, Jonathan, is that's how Jesus himself approached his own life. He didn't look at himself and say, I'm great. He said, I'm here to speak the words that God gives me. I'm here to do the things that God tells me to do. I'm here to follow his will and prophecies. I don't have to create. I simply follow. I use the wisdom that God has given me, and I use all of the tools, but I follow. And it's not about me. It's about honoring God. It's about finding worthiness for us in our own unworthiness.
Being called to serve God is a privilege completely beyond our rank. Pleasing God and earning His favor only come through the merit of Jesus' sacrifice. Let us humbly engage in all that God puts before us, realizing that we are simply doing what He is expecting us to.
That's the whole point. And again, Jonathan, it's simple. Don't become full of yourself. And along the way, just from a personal perspective, Jonathan, you and I have worked together with Christian Questions for 26 years now. And I know that along the way, there's been a lot of ups and downs. And one of the things I appreciate very much is that along the way, there have been times where you would say to me, Rick, just be careful. Just be careful. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves. We don't want to get bigger in our own eyes because we've been given a wonderful, wonderful privilege. And it's so important to just help each other be full of the Lord, not ourselves. You can't be full of both. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. So what's the end result of all this? Well, the end result is glorious. It's glorious. After all this, like, oh boy, I got to be low, 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 low. Listen to this. Okay. Here's the glorious end result. All of our efforts to simply comply with what is expected of us will, at the end of our course, be met with powerful grace and acceptance. We're going to drop in just from 2 lines from the parable of the talents, and that takes place at the end of the work of all of these servants, and the master returns. And here's what he says to them in Matthew 25:21.
His master said to him, "Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master."
You've been faithful in a few things. In those little things of life, I'll make you faithful in big things. Enter into the joy of your master. There's a power in that is remarkable. That's where the joy is. It's not your own. It's not that you're all full of yourself. It's that you're entering into the joy of your master. When we look at what this slave had to do outside of the house, are there spiritual responsibilities and the physical things, the work and the plow and the field and all of those things? That work gets sweaty. It's just not fun and pleasant, but it's hard work, but it's what's required. The inside work, it's like giving God a grain offering. It's offering a praise and honor, and it's taking moments and being sincere in that. Both of those are what's required. And it's not that you look at that and say, wow, I did such a good job. It's no, you say, I am so unworthy and God is so great. That's what this parable is about. It helps to put everything in a perspective, especially when you look at all of those previous parables, the parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, the prodigal son, the unjust steward, the rich man and Lazarus, and the unworthy servant. They bring us the parable of this unworthy servant that says, do what's put before you. Honor God with every moment. And if faithful unto death, you receive a crown of life. May God be praised in everything that we say and do. Think about it. Folks, we love hearing from our listeners. We welcome your feedback and questions on this episode or other episodes at christianquestions.com. Coming up in our next episode, what is God's will and how do I make it my will?